Can you learn 2 languages at the same time? Short answer, yes, definitely. I'm currently doing exactly that with Spanish and Japanese. However, depending on how you do it, you're either in for a hard time or will have a at least somewhat smooth ride. In this video, we discuss how to be smart about learning 2 or even more languages at the same time. The strategies, time management, mentality, learning environments, and progress expectations. So whether you're planning to become a polyglot in 2025 or just try to learn a new language while maintaining another one you're currently learning, this video is for you. Before we get to the strategies that will let you allow to have consistent progress in multiple languages at the same time, we should talk about what not to do. Because these are the mistakes that make people give up on language learning entirely. Let's start with what I would consider to be the biggest mistake of them all, and that is to study similar languages as a beginner at the same time. So if you're just starting out, learning Spanish and Portuguese at the same time, so simultaneously, is a bad idea because you will just constantly mix up the two. If you really want to learn both of these languages, you should just start with one, Spanish for example, get really good at it, and then use a technique called language transfer. Language transfer will allow you to learn the second language much quicker because you use knowledge from one language to help you learn another. So the second language, in this case Portuguese, will become much easier to learn because you recognize so many patterns and can just differentiate between, this is how it works in Spanish, okay, it's only slightly different in Portuguese. I recognize the pattern, I understand it, I'm not gonna mix it up because my Spanish is already rock solid, and that's how you will learn the second language, Portuguese, much quicker. So to give you an example, a word like tiempo in Spanish becomes tempo in Portuguese, and you will be able to recognize this pattern and remember and learn these new words much quicker. Your brain gets better at spotting these patterns and using them to your advantage rather than getting confused by them. But this only works when you have a solid foundation in one of these languages. If you're an English speaker and want to learn Spanish, I can recommend the language transfer app to you. I think they also have other languages, but I only listen to the English to Spanish transfer. It's basically a podcast that teaches Spanish by showing you how much you already know as an English speaker. For example, words that end with T-I-O-N in English are the same in Spanish. You just need to change the T to a C. There's another reason why I wouldn't recommend learning 2 languages at the same time in general if you are a beginner in both of them. And that is that you can make use of different learning strategies, different learning techniques at different levels. But more on that in a bit. First, let's stick with the choice of languages. So I think the best thing you can do here is to pick them from different language families to not mix them up. My combination of Spanish and Japanese works really well here, because well, they're as different from another as languages can get. The second major mistake is switching between languages during the same study session. Pick one language per session and stick with it. When you're constantly switching between languages, you're forcing your brain to repeatedly change gears. This not only makes your study session less effective, but also more mentally exhausting. So it's better to dedicate focused time to each of the languages. And I would even advise to have some break between them. For example, I do my Japanese in the morning and I do most of my Spanish input throughout the day and in the evening. Trying to progress at the same rate in both languages is also another pitfall. It's simply not realistic. And it's not necessary either. Languages are different and often have very different challenging aspects. In English, grammar is fairly easy for me as a German native speaker. It's quite similar, at least most of the times. Pronunciation, on the other hand, is honestly quite challenging because it seems so random in English. In Japanese, pronunciation is quite predictable, whereas the grammar for me as a German and English speaker is a complete 180. And let's be honest here, language learning takes time. So if you decide to study 2 languages at the same time instead of focusing all of the time into one language, well, progress is gonna be slower. I don't believe in those learn a language in 5 or 10 minutes per day methods. To me, that's just wishful thinking. In my experience, you need at the very least 30 minutes per day or better an hour per day if you want to make real progress. Of course, maybe you define progress quite differently, but to me it needs to be noticeable, otherwise it can get quite frustrating. So I rather put in more time than progress very slowly. For me, that means planning for at least 2 hours daily between Spanish and Japanese. My Spanish immersion even has consistently been between 2 or even 3 hours. I do eventually want to reach similar numbers with the Japanese while reducing Spanish a little bit, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So I'm not really rushing this process, hopefully, because starting with too much too soon is simply a recipe for frustration. I'm very aware that learning Japanese will be tough and a lot more difficult than what I've experienced with Spanish, but I'm here for it. I'm here for the challenge. So knowing that, my expectations for the progress is also lower. But enough of what you shouldn't do, let's talk about what you should do. First of all, create distinct learning environments for both languages. This might sound a bit over the top, but it does help to separate the languages. For example, I have a different YouTube account for Spanish than for Japanese content. This way, when I use YouTube, I get recommendations only for the language I want to focus on at that moment. Time management is crucial, and in my opinion, it should be structured on a daily as well as on a weekly level. Like I said, I do Japanese in the morning and Spanish throughout the day with a focus on the evening. But you could also alternate days if that works better for you. The key is to find a rhythm that fits your schedule and energy levels and that you stick with. No matter which strategies, apps, or whatever you use, the best method is forever the one that you stick with, the one that you actually do. Consistency is the most important aspect when learning a language, and this becomes even more important when you study 2 or even more languages at the same time. Some people might prefer dedicating specific days to each language, Monday, Wednesday, Friday for one language, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday for the other language, with Sunday being off. Now the next tip applies to any situation, but even more so if you plan to study both languages daily like I do. You need to have a priority. Which language is the more important one to you? We all know what life is like. It throws random stuff at you all the time. So there will be days where you have to decide which language you will focus on. This decision, in my opinion, should already be set in stone before that day comes. My focus for now is Japanese. That's why I also do it in the morning, because whatever happens throughout the day, my Japanese learning will already be done. You could also extend these priorities over a larger amount of time with a variation of the 80-20 Pareto principle. You could spend about 80% of your active learning time on your priority language and 20% on maintaining your other language. This doesn't mean you're neglecting your second language, it's just about being realistic with your goals and time allocation. Your approach should also differ depending on what level you have in each of the languages. For my more advanced Spanish, I don't actually do any kind of real study. Basically everything I do are either passive or enjoyable activities, listening to podcasts when I head to the supermarket, watching Netflix or YouTube at night, or just naturally using it while traveling in South America or talking to my Peruvian girlfriend. The only active thing I'm currently experimenting with a little bit is writing to improve my speaking. I know that probably sounds weird, but I'll make another video about that in the future. For Japanese, on the other hand, where I'm a beginner, this situation is very different. I do need some structured study time, like my morning Anki sessions, for building that foundational vocabulary before getting started with immersion methods. So these different strategies for different levels are crucial. And I think it's quite easy to see how some of them are more mentally straining than others. When you're a beginner in a language, you need that structured foundation, or at least it just makes sense and progress more efficient. You could head into full immersion immediately and you will learn the language eventually as well, but it's not as effective as there is no real input for you that is comprehensible enough to make you learn fast from it. But once you reach that low intermediate level, you can shift to activities that feel less like studying and more like enjoying the language. Let me give you a concrete example how that plays out in my daily routine, because I think we are talking about kind of abstract concepts here and I want to make it more hands-on. A typical day starts with my Japanese study. Non-negotiable morning Anki sessions for vocabulary using the Core 2.3K deck, followed by the anime-based deck that gives me some grammar priming from Tai Kim's guide, as well as more vocabulary. I mentioned both these resources in my video about my plan of learning Japanese. This Anki study session is not particularly exciting, but I do believe it's necessary at this stage. I'm building the tools I need to enjoy Japanese content naturally in a couple of months. With these 2 decks done, my mandatory study session is completed and has reached about the 1 hour mark. Usually I also watch 20 to 30 minutes of very simple Japanese comprehensible input videos. Then later in the day, Spanish just happens naturally. I might be watching a YouTube video while eating lunch, chatting with my girlfriend, or listening to a podcast while doing my chores. I also use Langia, my own language learning app, mainly for the article translations and the daily stories feature. It's great because I can quickly read or listen to interesting content that's relevant to what I actually care about. But the key here is that I'm not studying the language. At least I wouldn't call this studying. I'm living Spanish, even though that sounds cringe as hell. But this is what you should aim for with your more advanced language. This brings me to another important point about expectations and progress tracking. With the Japanese, I have clear, measurable goals, learning a specific number of kanji, completing certain grammar points, reaching a vocabulary target. But with Spanish, my goals are... I don't know, what are my goals? I just engage with the language and get better automatically. That's all I need and all I want at this stage. The only goal I have, now that I think of it, is that I want to improve my spoken Spanish by turning passive vocabulary into active vocabulary. Writing is my bridge here, as I said earlier. In the evening, I get some more Spanish exposure. Sometimes I watch something on Netflix, and usually I also read 20 to 30 minutes at night, in Spanish, obviously. I switched to Spanish only for both of these activities a while ago already. By the way, soon Lengia will support EPUB and PDF upload for reading sessions, while of course supporting all the other cool things like grammar and vocabulary simplifications and instant flashcards. I think that will make reading even more fun, useful, and also approachable. So there you have it, a realistic approach on how to tackle two languages at the same time. The key takeaways are pretty straightforward. Create separate environments, establish clear priorities, and adapt your methods based on your level in each language. Most importantly, be realistic with your time commitment and expectations, and don't learn two similar languages at once as a beginner. Also remember that it's okay to have one of your languages in sort of maintenance mode, where you don't actively force yourself to improve in it, but just keep it at the level where it is. If you want to see a more detailed breakdown of how I'm applying these principles to learning Japanese and my general plan for the different stages, check out this video next. And this can be applied to basically any language, not just Japanese. Thank you for watching. I hope there was at least something in the video that you can take away for your own language learning journey. Let me know in the comments if you are currently learning multiple languages at once or planning to. And other than that, have a great day. I'll see you next time.